Welcome to this special episode of the ECGI podcast. I'm Nadya Malenko, professor of finance at Boston College and editor of the ECGI Working Paper Finance series. Today, I'm joined by Joseph Kalmenovitz, co-author of Escaping Pay for Performance, with Jason Chen and Jacob Hajda, which has been selected as the best paper in the ECGI Working Paper series for 2025, sponsored by WRDS. Joseph, congratulations and welcome.
Thank you very much. Glad to be here.
Before we begin, let me say a few words about the paper for our listeners to outline how it contributes to our series. Corporate governance research has long focused on aligning incentives inside firms. This paper asks the same fundamental question: what happens when you tie pay to performance? But in a setting where the stakes for society are arguably even higher. Financial regulators oversee the banking system, securities markets, and systemic risk. How they are recruited, motivated, and retained is a first-order governance question, not just a public administration one. The paper studies the pay of the highest-ranking executives in the federal government, the leaders of regulatory agencies, making this fundamentally a question of executive compensation and incentives, similar to those studied in corporate governance within firms. In that sense, the paper brings the tools of the executive compensation literature to the governance of the institutions that oversee firms and markets. The paper also speaks directly to the revolving door literature, highlighting how compensation incentives shape the movement of talent between regulators and the firms they oversee. So let me start by asking Joseph some questions. Joseph, the headline result of your paper is quite counterintuitive. Performance pay was introduced to retain talented regulators and close the pay gap with the private sector. However, the paper finds it increased voluntary exits by 43 to 57%. What was your first reaction when this result emerged from the data?
Thank you, Nadia. And I want to say first, thank you to ECGI and for our sponsors, WRDS, for this recognition. It means a great deal, both for me and my co-authors. And I want to start by saying that this paper is as part of a broader research agenda on the economics of regulation. And what we're basically asking is, where does regulation come from and what is the economic impact of regulation? And part of that literature is to look at the human factor. These are the people who write regulations and enforce them. These are the career bureaucrats. So we started with a very basic observation, which is that the federal government, when they try to motivate these career bureaucrats, they think about payment. And one of the main challenges is how to retain top talent inside the government. So when we first saw the results, which is actually when they implemented these reforms that backfired and people voluntarily left the government, we were quite surprised. That was definitely not the intent of these reforms. But what's interesting is, as we thought about this and we dug deeper into the data, it actually makes a lot of sense economically. Because what happens is when you introduce performance pay, it doesn't operate in a vacuum. What you do is you tie the regulator's pay to a measurable output. And what happens is a lot of things happen at the same time. You increase effort, which is great. That is one of the reform's goals, but you're also making their skills more visible to everybody else, including the private sector. Now, not only that, you're also creating income risk, which before that was not present in the government. And finally, what we think is also very important is that you use an evaluation system that a lot of people inside the government don't actually trust. They think it's not fair, it's opaque, it's biased, and it's not working for them. So we used our data on these 30,000, give or take, individual regulators to try to disentangle all of this mechanism. And what's interesting also, which I think you alluded to before, we have a separate set of analysis on a very different reform, which related to the senior executive service. These are the top executives in the federal government, and they react surprisingly similar to these rank and file individuals in financial agencies.
Thank you. That's fascinating, because at first glance, performance pay should help retention, not hurt it. This brings me to a broader governance question. Corporate governance, we sometimes assume that stronger pay for performance improve incentives without fundamentally changing the workforce. While your results suggest that when outside options are strong, incentive pay can actually change who stays and who leaves. How do you think governance scholars should think about that trade-off? Does it change how we should think about the design of incentive contracts more broadly?
That's a great question. And I think it goes to the heart of what makes this paper interesting beyond the economics of regulation, also for the broader governance community. Now, instead of models, we try to think about contracts and design an optimal contracts to elicit effort. And we essentially assume that the participation is fixed. Now, what we find in our paper is that whenever you have a very strong outside option, for instance, here financial regulators can exit to Wall Street, which is a very strong and lucrative outside option, then this participation constraint is not fixed. It's actually endogenous. So what happens is when you create really powerful incentives, you motivate more effort, but you also make it more attractive to these people to leave the government. And I think this is generalizes not just to the context of government and regulation, but also to the broader context of corporate governance. Every time you have labor market where talent is scarce and talented people have a very lucrative outside option, doesn't have to be government, could be tech, anything finance, medicine, universities. When you introduce aggressive pay for performance, you're going to have unintended effects on selection into the government and selection outside of the government. And I think the key lesson here for governance scholar is that contract design needs to account both for the intensive margin, which is the effort inside your institution, but also for the extensive margin, which is retention and selection in and out of the organization.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. What I also really like about your paper is that it reframes the revolving door debate. Prior research often asks whether the revolving door leads regulators to be more lenient or captured by industry, while your paper instead asks what causes the revolving door in the first place. And the answer that well intentioned pay reform can unintentionally accelerate the revolving door has important implications for how we think about regulatory design. So I wonder, were policymakers aware of this risk when the reforms were introduced?
Well, the short answer is no. The slightly longer answer is we don't think, based on reading of contemporary papers and publication, we don't think these policymakers were aware of that risk fully ex ante. And actually, when you think about it, the motivation for all of these reforms, which started in the late 1980s, was sort of a competition between financial regulators and the companies that they oversee, the financial sectors. The goal was to prevent these revolving door that was much more prevalent back in the 80s and 90s. And the idea was to link pay to performance and thus kind of slow down this revolving door. And the irony, of course, now that we analyze those reforms, is that by making pay more sensitive to performance, you actually accelerate the revolving door, the exact outflow that you were trying to stop. And we provide, I think, a very nice, clean setting to identify this causal link between pay for performance and the revolving door and how this affects the flow of talent from the public sector to the private sector. And this is very important because, revolving door is not just a story of pure and simple labor market. It has a lot of implications because these people that revolve from the government to the private sector, they also have a lot of control over regulation as long as they are in the government. So whatever shapes their incentive is going to shape how regulation is being written, how it is being interpreted, how it is being enforced. So when you have bank examiner that just leave the FDIC and go work for the bank that they used to supervise, you're going to lose something really important in how the agency can work.
Very interesting. Next, maybe I would like to ask you about the paper's most policy relevant insight, which is also quite timely given current debates about the federal workforce reform in the US. You find performance pay did work in raising effort. Rulemaking activity increased by roughly 60 to 75%. But the very regulators who responded most strongly to the incentives were also the ones most likely to leave. Do you think there is some pay policy that gets you the productivity gains without the exits? Your structural model explores some counterfactual policies. What does it suggest about how policymakers might try to balance that trade-off?
Yeah, so exactly. This is where the structural model becomes really valuable because in the reduced form analysis and the clean identification, where we show that performance pay is going to increase effort and also exit, and it all happens at the same time for similar reasons. Now, what the structural model is doing, it let us think about counterfactual pay schemes where essentially the government is going to pull different levers to try to maybe link pay to performance, but mitigate the revolving door if this is something they actually choose. They don't have to do that, but if they are interested, we think about how to do this. And what we show is that this trade-off between effort and exit or effort and retention is endogenous, but it's also manageable. So one of the things we talk about is, sure, you can introduce a modest performance-based component, but you can combine it with a sort of flat across the board increase in the base pay. This is going to mitigate some of the incentives to leave the federal government. Another thing that we highlight is you kind of go, all in, and you introduce really high-powered incentives that would mimic what's in the private sector. You're basically going to double down on the revolving door, and it's going to be a substantial cost in the ability to retain talent in the government. And I would also note it's hard to ignore what's going on out there. And since January 25, there's a massive spotlight on those exact people that work in the government. A lot of that discussion is about their ability to monitor their performance. And I've been studying this for several years at this point, but now it's suddenly, everybody talk about it. There's a lot of interest in how do we manage this bureaucracy and how do we motivate them. And I think that this is part of a larger puzzle of how to think about the performance of the government, how to motivate regulators properly, especially now when there's a lot of political interest in trying to modernize the bureaucracy and try to think, from the fundamentals. Perhaps this paper would be able to make a little bit of a contribution beyond academic, but also when it comes to policymaking.
Yeah, indeed, that's very policy relevant, very timely. But your insights are also relevant to governance scholars studying executive pay at corporations. I wonder if you see parallels between the design of regulatory pay and the design of CEO compensation contracts. And where do you think the key differences lie?
So I think there are important parallels, but also very important differences. So I'm going to start with the parallels. First of all, if you think about this sort of in an abstract way, whether you're in a corporate boardroom thinking about the compensation package or you're in regulatory agencies, you have a similar challenge. You want to design a contract that give really good incentives to elicit as much effort and improve performance, but you also want to retain the talent and avoid losing your best CEOs to the competitors. So it's the same challenge. Now, in corporation, we also have CEOs that have really good outside options. They can always leave. And in regulation, we have the same. These are the good examiners, the good, SEC auditors that can also always leave the government and move to the private sectors. Um, but I want to talk about the differences because they can also highlight the economics here. A really important factor that keeps regulators in the government is the intrinsic motivation. They want to work in the government. They believe in whatever. They believe in the role of regulation. They like the quiet life. They like this balance. Whatever it is, it's about intrinsic motivation. And what we show in the paper is that once you introduce pay for performance, in a environment where people have a sort of a mission-driven orientation, this is going to be a trade-off. You're going to eliminate part of this motivation, which I'm not sure apply in equal force to the CEO context. But the other thing, which is also maybe important, is about the type of work that people do. So, no disrespect to CEOs, but what happens in the government, these regulators work on rules. They write the rules and they also implement the rules. So whatever happens inside the government, I like to say, doesn't stay in the government. It always spills over to the private sectors, and it's going to affect how they regulate markets. So I would just say, coming back to the what I think are the key similarities. When you design the executive pay, you can't just assume that this is all you need to do is to provide high-powered incentives. And in fact, the stronger incentives you provide, you might actually lose that talent if you operate in a competitive labor market with scarce talent.
One of the paper's most subtle contributions, and you touched upon this in what you just said, is documenting who leaves. It's not random attrition. It's the regulators with better outside options and weaker intrinsic attachment to public service. Those with strong mission orientation stay. Is this sorting actually a problem?
That's a great question. The answer is it depends. It's a little nuance. On one hand, one of our findings could show something pretty positive. What happens after those reform is that regulators that are more mission driven, they are in there for the intrinsic motivation, they're the ones that are more likely to stay after the performance pay. They could say that's actually great because you have a more dedicated, committed workforce that stay there because they want to work in the government. That sounds great. The problem is that in order to produce effective regulation, you need to be mission driven, but you also need to have technical expertise, especially when it comes to financial regulation, which is the primary setting we study. You need to understand market, you need to understand derivatives, how bank capital structure works, systemic risk. It's very expert dependent domain. And what happened is that those who leave for the private sectors are the ones that have the best skills, the more sophisticated, marketable, transferable skills. And we really see that after the reforms, those who leave get much higher pay in the private sector, suggesting that these are better talented or much better skilled. So what happens is a sort of a trade-off. You kind of get a workforce that is more dedicated, but perhaps less has less expertise and less skills compared to what you had before the reform. And that's a very difficult trade-off, which I think was not just not anticipated, but overall could actually leave you with a sort of a hollowed up workforce.
Thank you. Finally, I wanted to discuss your findings on evaluation opacity. They're particularly interesting and generalizable to the corporate setting. You find that exits were concentrated in agencies where employees perceived performance appraisals as unclear or unfair, and among employees with few comparable peers, making those evaluations noisier. This connects to a broader governance literature on the credibility of performance measurement. Do you think there are lessons for boards designing incentive systems inside firms as well?
Absolutely. We think this finding has broad applicability beyond the setting. So, what happens is that what we found in our setting is that when the performance appraisal, the process by which you evaluate performance, is perceived by employees as opaque or arbitrary, unfair, unpredictable, whichever word you want to choose, they think that they basically work for nothing. It's a risk that they're taking by staying in the government and they're not compensated for that. They don't understand what is the connection between what I do and what I get paid. And this is a recipe for dissatisfaction and ultimately for even more exit in these opaque environment. What we use here is a pretty interesting thing. The federal government is very introspective in the sense that they run surveys to understand how the workforce think about a lot of things, including how do they evaluate the evaluation system? It's called the Federal Employee Viewpoint Survey, and it measures trust and a whole lot of other questions. And what we find is that agencies where employees rate the appraisal system very poorly are exactly the agencies that suffer the most from these mass exits post reforms. Another thing which we borrowed directly from the executive comp literature is we forget about the survey. We looked at environments where regulators work in really small, specialized roles. There are very few peers that you can benchmark in order to assess your performance. And that's exactly the type of regulators that are leaving. This is clearly related to this relative performance evaluation idea. You need a large sample to compare. When you have a small sample, evaluation is noisy. People don't trust the system, and they just leave. And what happens is that when employees don't trust the evaluation, you give them high-powered incentives, but they're not implemented correctly or effectively or in a trustworthy way. So you're going to drive away the people who could have thrived under a better evaluation system. So what I would say is that if you want to introduce high-powered performance-based incentive, you should also invest really heavily in a measurement process. What are the metrics? How transparent is the process? How many peers can you compare before you really kind of dial up the power of the incentive? So what we show here is that the same performance-based policy has a very different effect depending on how much you invested in all of the evaluation process.
Thank you. This is fascinating and directly applicable for corporate boards. Before we close, I want to briefly return to the broader policy context. The paper opens by noting that since the 2024 US elections, federal regulators have come under intense scrutiny, and the new administration has sought to tighten the link between pay and performance. This research speaks directly to that moment. The paper is a reminder that governance isn't only about what happens inside boardrooms. The institutions that oversee firms and the people who staff them are equally subject to the incentive problems that governance scholars have been studying for years. This paper brings rigorous empirical methods to this question, along with a structural model for policy evaluation, and deserves recognition in our series. Listeners are encouraged to read it on the ECGI website. We would also like to thank our sponsor, WRDS. Wharton Research Data Services is a platform aggregating more than 600 databases from more than 60 data vendors, incorporating over 550 terabytes of data, and advancing comprehensive thought leadership by allowing users to analyze complex data and develop academic research. With that, I'd like to thank Joseph for joining me today and congratulate him again, along with his co-author Jason Chen and Jacob Hajda, for winning this year's prize.